Once upon a time, in an ancient corner of the world called Anshan, where the sun seemed to rise more golden and the wind brought stories of forgotten times. It was there, among dry mountains and silent valleys, that a boy named Cyrus was born. The year was around 600 BC, and no one imagined that this baby with alert and restless eyes would change the destiny of kings, peoples, and even the faith of an entire nation. They said that his birth was shrouded in mystery. A prophecy circulated among the elders. The grandson of King Astyages of Media would be responsible for overthrowing his own grandfather. Frightened by this vision, the king tried to change the course of destiny. He ordered that the child be killed at birth. But, and here comes that twist that fate loves to throw in, the officer in charge of the task with a heavy heart couldn't do it. Instead, he gave the boy to a shepherd in the mountains. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. If this content touches your heart and you want to support us, feel free to click on the Thanks a Lot button. All help is welcome and makes a big difference. Cairo grew up far from palaces, among sheep, rocks, and open skies. He ran through the fields as if the world were his alone. He learned about humility, strength, and the silence of the earth. But even though he lived as a simple peasant, something about him stood out. He had a look that seemed to see beyond the obvious. And when he spoke, even the elders stopped to listen. There was something different about that boy. It was as if he knew he was part of something bigger, something that was yet to come. Years passed, and the truth came to light. Cairo was not the son of a shepherd. He was of royal blood. And when he finally returned to the world of kings, it was not with fear or hesitation. It was as if he was simply returning to the place that had always been his. And there, his destiny began to fall into place like pieces of an ancient puzzle. Cairo was no longer the boy from the hills. Now, with the truth flowing freely like a river in flood, he was recognized as the grandson of Astyages, the powerful king of the Medes. But instead of getting lost in the glitz of the royal halls or bowing down before the grandfather who once wanted to wipe him off the face of the earth, Cyrus stood firm, the same bright-eyed boy who had learned to listen to the silence of the earth. Only now, he heard something else. The sound of destiny, beating loudly like a drum before war. Astyages, realizing that his grandson was alive and gaining support, tried to stop him, but it was too late. The people, tired of the king's harsh and selfish rule, began to see Cyrus as a new hope. One by one, allies arrived, swearing allegiance not out of fear, but out of choice. And that's when the flame turned into a fire. In a twist that seemed straight out of an old book, Cyrus gathered an army. It wasn't the largest, but it was driven by something invisible to the eye: purpose. And with this army, he marched against his own grandfather. The battle was fierce, but victory was clear. Astyages fell, and Cyrus united two worlds into one. Persia and Media, until then separated by tradition, became an empire under his command. But Cyrus didn't stop there. He didn't want to be just another king on the throne. There was something in him that wouldn't rest, a constant restlessness, as if he still had much to do. His eyes now turned westward, where other rich and powerful nations waited, confident in their walls and armies. But Cyrus carried something that no wall could stop. And it was in this spirit that he took his first step toward Lydia, where destiny awaited him with a gold coin in one hand and a divine omen in the other. By this point, Cyrus was no longer just a victorious warrior. He was the center of attention throughout the East, but behind the glitz of victory was a man of flesh, soul, and keen instinct. It was hard not to notice him. He walked among soldiers and wise men with the same ease, and when he spoke, he did not shout. He only said what was necessary, firmly and calmly. There was something in his gaze that made others pay attention, as if each word could change the course of events. Cyrus was not driven by a thirst for power, but by an almost invisible sense of mission. He was not content with reigning for the sake of reigning. He wanted to organize, protect, and give space for each people to live their faith, their culture, their roots. This was new, different. At that time, kings ruled, and that was that. But Cyrus listened. He met with leaders from conquered regions, asked questions, observed, and did what no conqueror did. He respected them. This left many people baffled. How could a man who defeated kings treat the defeated with such dignity? That was where the secret lay. He did not see enemies, he saw future allies. He knew that an iron empire could be broken, but an empire built on respect. No one could easily overthrow that. And this way of leading opened paths where there had once been walls. Peoples began to surrender without a fight, just because of his name. It was as if Cyrus' very presence was an invitation to change. But not everyone saw it that way. To the west, a king surrounded by riches and oracles watched with suspicion as this ruler, who did not seem to fit the rules of the game, approached. On the other side of the map, where gold flowed like a river and palaces glistened in the morning sun, lived Croesus, king of Lydia. They said he was the richest man in the world. His name was synonymous with fortune, and his confidence greater than his walls. When he heard about Cyrus, he laughed. A young king of the desert coming from dry lands, thinking he could threaten his glory. Impossible. But Croesus was not content to just laugh. He sought answers from the oracles, and the words came as a riddle. If Croesus crosses the river Halys, he will destroy a great empire. He smiled. He thought the empire that would be destroyed was Cyrus's. He did not realize that sometimes the truth comes in disguise. Ironic, isn't it? With armies at the ready and conviction in his eyes, Croesus marched toward the unknown. But Cyrus was already waiting, not with pomp, but with strategy. He studied every step, every weakness, like someone reading the wind before a storm. The meeting between the two was a clash. The drums of war echoed through the valleys, and spears flashed like lightning. Croesus tried everything, but what he lacked, Cyrus had in abundance: vision. In the final battle, the Lydian army was defeated, Croesus was captured, and in what seemed to be the end of the richest king in the world, something surprising happened. Cyrus ordered the pyre to be built to burn him, as was the custom. But at the last moment, before the flames and the sky that seemed to hold its breath, Cyrus heard Croesus's words about the oracle's warning and the fate of men. And then, in a gesture that no one expected, he ordered the fire to be extinguished. He saved his enemy, not out of weakness, but because something inside him told him that this moment was more important than simple revenge. After his victory over Croesus, Cyrus did not stop. The world seemed to open up before him like a living map, and his steps led him straight to the heart of Babylon, the city of hanging gardens, blue gates, high walls, and gods enthroned in golden temples. But behind the beauty, there was something rotten, a king who ruled with tyranny, and a people who whispered pleas for freedom in the shadows. Among these whispers were different voices, voices that did not speak the local language, voices of a people who had been taken by force years before from a land called Judah. They wept on the banks of the Euphrates River, far from home, far from the temple, far from what they called the promise. They were the Jews, exiled, crushed, forgotten. But someone had not forgotten them. Even before Cyrus thought of conquering Babylon, their God had already spoken through a prophet. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus. Yes, anointed, that was the word. The Jewish people believed that God had set apart that pagan Persian foreign king, Cyrus, to free them. And that is exactly what happened. Cyrus's entry into Babylon was more of a whisper than a shout. There was no great battle. the people opened the gates. The Babylonian soldiers laid down their weapons. It was as if everything had been prepared. Cyrus walked through the streets with respect, no destruction, no humiliation. And then came the decree. He allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. He gave them resources. He returned the temple utensils that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen, as if to say, "Go back, rebuild, worship your God in peace." That was not normal. It was not political. It was something greater. The Jews called him a liberator. But Cyrus just kept going, like someone obeying a voice that only he could hear clearly. And while Jerusalem rose from the dust, Cyrus looked beyond the plains of Babylon to an empire that needed more than swords. It needed wisdom. With Babylon now in his hands, Cyrus could do whatever he wanted, command, impose, dominate. But he did the opposite. He sat down with scribes, priests, merchants, and elders from every corner of the empire. He listened to what they had to say. And there, amid different accents and customs that seemed from other worlds, something rare was born. An empire where people did not have to abandon who they were to live in peace. Cyrus had a strange way of ruling, strange by the standards of the time. Instead of destroying local gods, he respected them. He returned their temples, allowed their rituals, and restored their altars. And this was not theater. He understood that the faith of a people is like the roots of a tree. Mess with them too much, and everything falls down. So he preferred to water them. This is where one of the most famous documents in ancient history came from, the Cyrus Cylinder. In it, the king is not filled with pride. He speaks of justice, freedom, and reconstruction. He writes that each people can return to their land, worship their gods, and rebuild what was lost. It is as if that piece of clay said, "Here, no one needs to forget who they are in order to live." This made even the defeated become allies. Instead of fear, Cyrus inspired respect. Instead of rebellions, he received support. The empire grew not only through the strength of swords, but through the strength of ideas. But the world does not stand still. While he was sewing together treaties and uniting peoples, in the east, a new challenge was beginning to take shape. A land of harsh plains, where nomadic warriors bowed to no one. The Scythians, the Massagetæ, tribes that lived beyond the reach of the great empires. Even with his empire spread out like an embroidered carpet across 3 continents, Cyrus did not rest. He was not the kind of king who sat on ivory thrones, counting coins or hanging medals. He preferred the beaten ground, meetings under tents, face-to-face conversations with generals and peasants. His way of governing mixed firmness with sensitivity, as if he carried an invisible scale. On one side, the sword, on the other, the right word at the right time. When necessary, he was as hard as stone. But he knew when to retreat, when to listen, when to forgive. And that at that time was almost a miracle. Where other emperors ordered people to be killed at the slightest sign of disobedience, Cyrus called them in for a talk, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. He knew that fear compels, but respect builds. He did not write laws just to punish. He wrote to protect the weakest, to ensure that justice was not owned by anyone. He set up a system that kept the satrapies, as the regions of the empire were called, organized, with governors who were accountable but free to take care of their people. It was as if he saw the empire not as a hungry monster, but as a living body, each part important, each functioning in harmony. But not everything could be solved with diplomacy. Sometimes it was necessary to bare one's teeth, and that was what began to take shape in the eastern winds. Nomadic, indomitable peoples with sharp eyes and bows on their backs began to stir. They cared nothing for treaties or gold. They lived off what they conquered and bowed to no king. Cyrus, who had already defeated giants, would now face warriors who had no palaces or thrones, but whose courage made the ground shake. And it was in this wild terrain that destiny called him once again. in an unexpected and fatal way. On the other side of the empire, where the sun rises drier and the wind blows like a blade, lived the Massagetae. Desert warriors, their skin weathered by time, led by a woman whom many feared just by hearing her name, Cyrus. She wore no crown, but she was queen. She ruled with her bow, her horse, and the hearts of a people who bowed to no one. It was with this people that Cyrus crossed paths. The war began like others, reconnaissance, strategies, and advances, but it soon became clear that the Massagetae were not like previous kingdoms. They had no walls to tear down or cities to occupy. They were the desert itself in motion. Worse, they were ready to die fighting. Cyrus tried a trick. He left wine and food in an empty camp, like someone leaving bait. Cyrus's son fell into the trap. He was captured. Then he died. They say that pain turned to fury in the queen's eyes. She swore revenge with words that cut deeper than a sword. Then came the great battle. It wasn't in a city, but on a plain. There were no stands or official records, only earth, blood, and screams. They say Cyrus fought like never before. His armor was covered in dust, his horse was panting, his face was marked by time, but his eyes were still full of purpose. Only this time, fate had other plans. Surrounded and wounded, Cyrus fell. No one knows exactly how. Some say it was an arrow. Others say it was a sword. But what matters is that there, in the middle of the red dust, fell the king who had liberated peoples, united empires, and changed laws. His body was recovered by his men, and his soul, well, that seemed to have left before, silently, like someone who knows they have fulfilled their duty. Cyrus's body was carried back in silence, as if even the horses understood the weight of that moment. There was no celebration, no victory hymns. The man who had once been hailed by crowds was now accompanied by soldiers in mourning, their faces covered in dust and their eyes lost in the distance. The way back seemed longer than all the conquests he had ever made. When they arrived in Pasargadae, the city he himself had ordered to be built, time seemed to stand still. There was the stone tomb, simple, without exaggeration, without ostentation. A stone box with an inscription that said much more than any golden statue. "O man, I am Cyrus, who founded the Persian Empire. Do not envy this land where I rest." And that was it, an entire empire at his feet. But he preferred to be remembered as someone who built, not as someone who ruled. His legacy was not in wars, but in the bridges he built between peoples. People who would never have lived together in peace now shared the same map, not out of fear, but out of respect. But the most curious thing of all came later. Among the records that remained, a detail emerged that no one expected. Prophets of a distant people had already spoken the name of Cyrus, many years before he was born. They said that God would call him by name, that he would use him as an instrument of liberation. And everything happened just as it was written. How could a pagan king fulfill the promises of a God he didn't even know? It's a mystery. But there, between the lines of history, you can see that Cyrus was more than just a king. He was part of something bigger. As the desert dust settled on Cyrus's tomb, life went on. Far away, among the rocks and hills of Jerusalem, the Jewish people walked with steady steps towards something that seemed impossible just a few years ago. The reconstruction of the temple. Hammers struck, wood was cut, stones were carefully stacked. But each blow from those men carried more than physical effort. It was memory, it was faith, and in the midst of that sacred dust, Cyrus's name was whispered with reverence. He was not Jewish. He did not follow their traditions, but he was the one who opened the doors. He was the one who ordered the return of the objects stolen from the temple, who signed the decree that became hope, and that became a mark. Prophets called him the Lord's anointed, as if he had been placed there for a purpose, even without understanding everything. Over time, Cyrus's name came to live on in more than just historical records. He became a symbol. Among the Persians, he was the just king. Among the Jews, he was the liberator. Among scholars, he was a figure who broke the mold of the conquerors of his time. His way of governing, balancing the sword and compassion, became a rare example in a world ruled by fear. And the most curious thing, he left no long dynasties or glorious heirs. His son Cambyses even tried to follow in his footsteps, but his father's brilliance was difficult to match. What really remained was history. One of those stories that stands the test of time, like a rock that even the wind cannot erase. Because Cyrus's greatness was not only in the cities he conquered or the victories he racked up. It was in the impact he had on others, in how he changed the course of thousands of lives without raising his voice, in how he was remembered by peoples who did not even speak his language. And then, when the dust of centuries finally settles, what remains of Cyrus is not just the trail of an empire. It is the silence after the thunder. It is that feeling that even after the end, he still walks among the pages of history, not as a distant king, but as someone who looks us in the eye and asks, "And you, what will you do with the power you have in your hands?" Because deep down, Cyrus teaches us something simple but rare. That true strength does not lie in oppression, but in balance. That a ruler does not need to destroy in order to be respected. That it is possible to win battles without killing the spirit of the other. He showed that listening is more powerful than silencing. That respecting the path of others does not erase our own. On the contrary, it strengthens it. He teaches us that faith can cross borders, and that even a king who did not know the God of Israel can be used as an instrument of liberation. It makes us think, doesn't it? How many times does something or someone appear in our path without making sense, but in the end reveals a greater purpose? Sometimes the unlikely is exactly what God chooses to fulfill a plan. And even in the face of death, Cyrus did not try to aggrandize himself. He did not want pyramids or giant sculptures. He just wanted to rest in the land he loved, with simple words engraved on stone, as if to say, "Don't see me as a god, see what I have built with justice." His story is not just about achievements. It is about purpose, about the courage to do things differently, about seeing far even when the world insists on looking shallow. And maybe, just maybe, that's what's missing today. Someone who, even without knowing everything, decides to act with truth, justice, and heart, like Cyrus did, like we can also do. If you liked Cyrus's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.